a bill that seeks to amend the Act governing the Asset Management Corporation of Nigeria, AMCON, is currently being considered by Nigeria's lawmakers. Now, the amendment to the Act is expected to make AMCON a more effective institution. Where earlier today, I spoke to Professor Koyin Ajayi, a lawyer and managing partner at Olaniwun Ajayi LP, on the significance on the proposed changes to the AMCON Act. Take a look.
The key elements of the amendment that is proposed seeks to cure some major operational issues that have arisen since the operation of AMCON, and also from the interpretation that the courts have given to some of the provisions which go against legislative intent. So it's important to understand why we're doing this. So that's principally the reason why. It does three things. The biggest thing it does is to enact what has been agreed between the banks and AMCON to set up a fund, a sinking fund, they call it, which, will act as a backstop to the federal government guarantee of AMCON bonds. So that's the thrust of the provision, but then it does a few other things. The other things it does is it looks at the process of purchase of assets by AMCON. And as you know, AMCON is a corporation that was set up with little or no money, and is therefore being funded by everybody else apart from government. So the legislative scheme was for government to guarantee all the debt instruments or securities that AMCON issues by which it will raise money. And there has been a bit of uncertainty as to the nature of this guarantee, whether it's automatic, whether it has to be written, whether the minister has to agree to it. So the provision seeks to clarify what that does. So, and that's very important from the point of view A, of AMCON being able to issue bonds, B, for those bonds to be tradable, especially in international markets.
Professor, yes. For the sinking fund, because I know that the banks have already begun to make such contributions. Yes. So the act now, is it, or the amendment, as it were, would it now give, or what it seeks to do now is just to simply give it legal teeth or legal backing, as it were?
Well,
they're already doing it.
It's legal today because there's an agreement which is enforceable in the court. So it's legal. So it's not trying to cloak illegality with legality. All it's trying to do is to give statutory backing to something that is a voluntary agreement. Now, because it's an agreement, there's nothing that stops a bank from saying, well, I'm going to breach the contract. So what do? You go to court, which would defeat the aim of the scheme. So what is being done now is two things. First of all, give it statutory backing. Okay. And then bring some necessary incentives into the scheme, which cannot be done by agreement. So, for instance, the provision that is proposed now allows contributions by banks to be treated as allowable deductions for the purpose of tax.
Okay.
Right? So that's very key for the banks, clearly. The second thing is that the way the scheme is set up now is such that if there's default by a bank, there's a penalty by statute.
Okay, so the CBN doesn't have to, because we know that the CBN, the Central Bank of Nigeria, being the financial regulator, they obviously have their own punitive measures that they would already have in place. So how is that going to be different from that of the of AMCON?
Well, because it was an agreement, there was nothing, CBN cannot penalize you for breaching an agreement. So, I mean, if a bank says it's going to give you a loan and doesn't give you the loan, CBN doesn't punish the bank. It's not part of any of the laws that CBN operates. So what this does now is, as I said, to provide legal backing and legal sanction for failure to provide the funding. Now, all we're trying to do is this, simply with the sinking fund. The bond have been issued. they're guaranteed by the federal government. But in order to insulate the federal government from the risk of the paying under the contingency of failure, we have a sinking fund so that AMCON is to pay. If AMCON cannot pay, then we fall on the sinking fund. It is if there is no money in the sinking fund that we then call on the federal government guarantee. Now, obviously, this is also very important for our monetary policy, for the rating of the country, because if there was no backstop, then there's be this huge contingency of, well, today 5.7 trillion, hopefully by December 3.6 trillion, because AMCON intends to pay off 2 trillion by the end of the year.
First, if I can just comment here, is the Act also going to address the longevity of AMCON, the lifespan of AMCON? Because I know that's also been a subject of debate. When they first came in, we had 10 years. 2 years down the line, we heard it had been increased by 2 years or something. We had the IMF asking the AMCON to wind down the next 7 years. So there's a bit of a conflict as to how much more longer AMCON has to remain in existence.
Right. Okay. The thing is this. The executive bill proposed by government was to give AMCON a sunset date. And so AMCON then was supposed to be an entity that will last only 10 years, which is, for instance, the Malaysian model. But the legislators, in their judgment, and rightly probably so too, because the nature of the Nigerian problem is such that it was so deep, so wide, that it probably would have taken much more than 10 years to solve. So AMCON was created in perpetuity, like every other corporation in the country. Now, one thing that the amendment does is not to give a lifespan to AMCON, but it gives a lifespan to the sinking fund. So there is a definite provision that says the tenure of the fund is 10 years from 2014, subject to an increase by another 5 years, depending on the funding model, the growth of the banking sector, and the efficiency with which AMCON is able to comply with the provisions of the law, which requires it to realize as much as it can in the best way it can. So AMCON is still going to be there. If it finishes this round, it'll be cleaned up. AMCON is like a corporation that will be winding down its activities. God forbid, but there's this cycle. There's always a bubble. So if there's a bubble tomorrow and there's a bust, then we have AMCON